Welcome back everybody to our studies of the Tudors for AQA A-level history. We are continuing in this lesson talking about the government of Henry VIII. Focusing specifically on government and crown and parliament, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the ministers of Henry VIII, a period of the history in which we see a shift from conciliar government as per the legacy of Henry VII to a government which relies almost entirely on the work of individual ministers. We will then talk about some domestic policies as well as the establishment of royal supremacy. Now, this probably won't be the only lesson we do on government. I am fully intending on going back over this series and going through and adding more meat to the bones, if you will, thinking about some of the context of some of these different issues in more detail. And if you're watching this in the future, then that has already happened and I will already have other government videos. But ultimately, this is going to be a video that we think quite broadly about the concept of government, the concept of crown and parliament, the concept of ministers, as well as domestic policies. And so ultimately, I noted in the previous video, when we looked at the legacy of Henry VII, as we go into looking at Henry VIII, that one of the things that we see is that Henry VII leaves a legacy of conciliar government. That's one of the things that he leaves in his wake when he dies. And we noted that when it came to the reign of Henry VIII, almost every single aspect of his father's legacy was trampled on by himself quite quickly. So peaceful foreign policy, that went out the window quite quickly. A strong relationship with the Catholic Church, that very much went out the window very quickly. A financial extraction mechanism through the Council Learned, that also went out quite quickly. And so too did conciliar government. The conciliar government then shifts from early in his reign to later on in his reign, when we see the reliance heavily on specific individual ministers. So, beginning first then, we'll think about the idea of crown and parliament. Henry's relationship with parliament is categorized by a slight amount of cooperation, I would argue, but for the most part manipulation. Initially, he did respect the traditional powers of Parliament and would convene Parliament for a number of very important reasons for key matters, especially in the early years of his reign. But as his reign starts to progress, his relationship with Parliament begins to evolve, as his reign begins to focus more specifically on one specific issue, the issue being, of course, the break from Rome with the Pope and the Catholic Church. And so early on in his reign, we can see that Henry called Parliament mainly to grant taxation, to approve laws, and to address issues relating to inheritance and to land disputes. He often relied heavily on his personal authority rather than the authority of Parliament. So, for example, his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and his early financial struggles were key reasons for calling Parliament. Some of his early financial struggles are due to his extravagant lifestyle, another part of, and also some early wars that we see as well. This is another part of Henry VII's legacy that is essentially trampled on by Henry VIII, a large treasury that gets depleted very, very quickly. These were all key reasons for calling Parliament, but for the most part, this was often a very limited role, again, often limited to supporting the king's decision. Things do change, though, between 1529 and 1536, when we see that the most dramatic shift comes from the establishment of royal supremacy. Henry's major essentially his major initiative in the 1520s and the 1530s, a good chunk of his reign, was to secure a divorce from Catherine of Aragon and to marry Anne Boleyn, and to, in the process, secure the break from Rome, and to secure the establishment of the Church of England. From 1529 onwards, Parliament would start to play an increasingly pivotal role in the use of breaking from the Catholic Church. We'll see in the next slide, when we look at the ministers, this correlates almost entirely with the use of Cardinal Wolsey, and then Thomas More, and then specifically Thomas Cromwell in the establishment of the break from Rome, as Cromwell and More use more the, pardon the pun, more so use the power and the authority of Parliament to try and establish the Church of England and to establish Henry as being the supreme head. So, for example, legitimizing the decisions to break from the Catholic Church, we can see that this culminates with probably the most significant piece of legislation, which is the Act of Supremacy, the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which declares Henry, quote, the supreme head on earth of the Church of England, a move which consolidated his control over all religious and political matters. Parliament then became crucial as a tool for Henry to essentially get greater autonomy and control over his kingdom, particularly when we start to see his legitimizing and legalizing of his marriages to people like Anne Boleyn, for example. Through a series of further acts of Parliament, we can also see that Parliament passes laws that facilitates the break from Rome. So, for example, the Act in Restraint of Appeals from 1533, which stopped appeals to the Pope in Rome, as well as the Act of Annates in 1532, which restricted payments to Rome from the English clergy. Again, facilitating the sort of technical details and the procedural aspects which facilitated the break from Rome. These were legislative actions that were part of Henry's broader goal to ensure that his authority was to be supreme and that his authority was to remain unchallenged. Henry's reign also sees the rise of key ministers, as we have noted already, and these will play significant roles in his domestic and his foreign policies. Some of these ministers would start to rise to prominence due to their loyalty and their ability to navigate the complexities of Henry's court, while others were quite instrumental in the king's personal and political decisions. And as I mentioned, in the earlier couple of years of his reign, you see the continuation of what would be described as the conciliar form of government, but it isn't far into his the early stage of his reign before we start to see the rise of Cardinal Wolsey. Now, Cardinal Wolsey serves as Lord Chancellor from 1515 to 1529. Now, his rise, however, is a little bit more fluid than that. So he's appointed as Lord Chancellor in 1515, but he does sort of rise through the ranks from 1509 onwards, and he takes great care to be very, very meticulous in overseeing lots of different areas of administration. And that's what essentially catches the eye of Henry, that he is so meticulous in his work, and that makes him essentially a court favourite. So he oversees, for example, domestic administration, diplomatic administration, and the management of the church. Now, ultimately, his most notable contribution to the reign of Henry VIII is probably his role in the King's Great Matter. The King's Great Matter being, of course, his desire, Henry's desire to divorce, to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Now, Wolsey ultimately failed to do so. He failed to secure the annulment that led to his downfall. But despite this, he was very, very well renowned for his ability to manage the kingdom's finances, to manage legal matters. He was an individual of legal training, and to manage diplomatic relations as well. He would ultimately die before he goes to as he is arrested, should I say, on the journey towards his towards potentially his eventual fate. But he dies before that actually happens, and so we then get the replacement of Cardinal Wolsey, who is Thomas More. More was Henry's Lord Chancellor after the fall of Wolsey, and he served until his resignation in 1532. He was a devout Catholic and initially supported the actions of Henry against Rome. But ultimately, his downfall comes in his refusal to support the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which, of course, was the act that would declare Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England, should I say, and this led to his execution for treason. We then get probably the most notable of the later period, the notable being that of Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was probably the most influential because he was pivotal in actually going about implementing the king's religious policies. He was, for example, the key architect of the English Reformation, and he helped to secure the break from Rome and was instrumental in the dissolution of the monasteries, which we'll get to in a second. He also plays a very key role in the administrative reform of government, but his downfall comes after he failed to secure a politically advantageous marriage for Anne of Cleves. Ultimately, Anne of Cleves, Henry was very much impressed with the picture of the painting of Anne of Cleves, and then once seeing the actual Anne of Cleves, was not as impressed with her likeness, and this ultimately led to Thomas Cromwell's downfall and his execution eventually in 1530. And so then we get from 1540, should I say, when we get to 1540, the period from 1540 to 1547 is a return to a conciliar form of government. We see the Duke of Norfolk and the Earl of Surrey being the prominent figures in the court, but the court starts to play a more hands-on role again after the downfall of Thomas Cromwell. We can see that there were many political developments during this part of the reign, including some marriage alliances, as well as the suppression of some rebellions. And his family also plays a key role in Henry's later years when it comes to managing the succession crisis. Finishing off then, one of Henry's most important legacies is the establishment of royal supremacy and the assertion of the monarch's authority over the church. This has far-reaching effects on both English politics and English religion. So we have, for example, the period between sort of 1527 and 1534, which is Henry's desire to divorce from Catherine of Aragon. This is the catalyst for the break from Rome. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul the marriage, Henry began to assert his own authority. The influence of Thomas Cromwell eventually, as well as the gradual shifting of political alliances, would allow Henry to manoeuvre Parliament into passing a series of laws which would break England's dependence on Rome. Henry's then desire for a male heir motivated him further to break from Rome. The belief that Catherine could not provide a male heir was, of course, one of those major issues that was problematic at the time. And so the break from Rome takes place over a period of time. It doesn't happen in one fell swoop. Arguably, if it did, it would be the Act of Supremacy. But it requires some further adjustments that we've already mentioned. Other legislation that essentially things that block appeals to the Catholic Church or block donations to the Church, for example. But we see that in 1533, Henry secretly marries Anne Boleyn. And by 1534, through the Act of Supremacy, he declares himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This not only solidifies control over religious matters, but also makes him the final authority in all matters of faith and doctrine. In 1534 as well, we get the Act of Succession, which further legitimised Anne's children, particularly Elizabeth, as heirs to the throne. Again, something we'll get to when we look at further succession issues following the death of Henry VIII, and then more importantly following the death of Edward VI, because Edward VI essentially, what we see with Henry VIII is Henry VIII, through a number of manoeuvrings, and even though he messed up quite a lot of the issues, eventually lays down the rules for succession, and then Edward VI basically scribbles them up and throws them in the bin. And so we have to then sort of start the whole process again to try and think about what the issue of succession is going to look like. We'll talk about this in more detail in a future lesson, but between 1536 and 1541, we see one of the most radical and controversial of Henry's policies, which was the seizing of monastic lands and wealth, contributing significantly to royal finances, but ultimately leading to the dissolution of the monasteries. It was also a way to weaken the power of the church, and solidify Henry's control, but it was also an economic and religious act aimed at consolidating power by removing the influence of the church and gaining their valuable assets. And it has a major impact on most of English society. Don't forget, the shift away from Catholicism, which had been a seminal part of English history for as long as England has existed, is a major factor of importance. And there's a reason why there is such a heavy backlash against Catholics that continues all the way through the Tudor dynasty, all the way through the Stuart dynasty, and even contributes to the downfall of one of the later Stuart monarchs, who happened to be Catholic, which caused a major problem for the fact that the King of England was supposed to be the head of the Church of England. They can't also be a Catholic as well. So this caused a lot of ripples in history that really do continue quite far into the future. Following the break from Rome as well, Henry introduced a number of religious reforms that ranged from the moderate to the more radical. So although he initially wanted to retain Catholic doctrine and practices, he also allowed certain Protestant reforms. So for example, the 6 Articles of 1539 reaffirmed Catholic beliefs in some areas, but by the end of his reign, England was on a trajectory towards Protestantism, particularly under influential figures like Cromwell, particularly under people like Edward, and then you sort of see a pulling back of Reformation issues when we think about the reign of Mary, because she was, of course, a devout Catholic. And then we have to then examine the religious sentiment under the reign of Elizabeth, when we start to see a little bit more of a stabilizing of the religious issues under the Tudor dynasty. But like I said just a second ago, this does not stabilize the issues entirely. We still have major problems that we will get to in future lessons' time.